Hi everyone, this is Jon Kelsen here at Drisha, back for Mishnah Bechorot. This is the third shiur in our Mishnah Bechorot series, which is itself part of our Mishnah in-depth offerings, part of the Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division here at Drisha. Rifka was a beloved student at Drisha and a lover of Mishnah herself, and all of our Mishnah teachings are dedicated to her name by her family and friends. So again, this is Mishnah Bechorot, part of our B'kiyut Mishnah series, and we are now in our learning. Let's share a source sheet here. We are now in our learning towards the middle of the tractate of Bechorot, where the Mishnah discusses mumim, blemishes. In chapter 6 and 7, the Mishnah lists a whole detailed list of blemishes of mumim, both for korbanot, both for sacrifices, animal sacrifices, and then interestingly, and this will occupy some of our attention here, interestingly also the blemishes of which disqualify a human, a kohen, a priest, from performing the service, the avodah, in the temple. Now, the source for these blemishes, and I'll get to why this is in Bechorot per se in a few moments, but the source for these lists of blemishes are in Sefer Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, chapters 21 and 22. I mentioned this in the past, but I'll mention again that Rabbi Avi Wallfish, who has taught many of these Mishnah shiurim himself, pointed out to me, I mentioned to him that it's interesting that several times in the tractate, or a few times in the tractate of Bechorot, there is juxtaposition of halachot relevant to animals and humans, and one of them is the juxtapositions is that of the blemishes of animals and the blemishes of the kohanim. So he pointed out in turn that the Mishnah here is taking its cue from the presentation in the Chumash, in Sefer Vayikra, where here, and we'll look at this together now, where here the Torah also juxtaposes basically the laws of a human mumim on a human being, of the kohen, and that of those of animal sacrifices. So the Mishnah here it's the organizing logic of the Mishnah here. Its sort of structural choices are informed or echoing that of the Chumash, that of the biblical backdrop from which it gets its inspiration. So Leviticus chapter 21. Here it's speaking to Aaron about the priests, about human blemishes. God says to Moshe, saying, and speak to Aaron, Daber el Aaron lemor, Ish mizaracha ledorotam asher yiyeh v'mum lo yikrav lahakriv lechem Elohav ki kol ish asher b'mum lo yikrav. Any man, no man, this is a JPS translation, no man of your offspring throughout the ages who has a mum, who they translate defect. Anyone who has such a mum, a defect, none of them shall be qualified, meaning they are disqualified. They translate here as to offer the food of his God. Lakriv lechem Elohav, right? Lo yikrav, shall not bring close. Karban, shall not perform sacrifices, shall not do the avodah. Anyone who has it, lo yikrav, who has such defects, shall not be qualified to do as such. Meaning to come close, to bring close to sacrifice. And then the Torah lists in some detail a whole series of blemishes. And this is picked up in the Mishnah, where the Mishnah also has rather detailed lists of blemishes. There's first of the animals and then of the kohanim, built off of the biblical list. Right here, it's ishiver o fiseach, a blind or a lame man, o charum o sarua, translated here as one who has limbs which are too short or too long, and it goes on to list, again, more and more blemishes. and summarizes, no man among the offspring of Aaron the priest who has such mumim, such defects can lo yigash, shall not come close. La krivat yishtei Hashem, lo yikrav, lo yigash are some have argued have sort of specific cultic technical meanings, but we'll say here for now, generally speaking, may not come forward, may not perform these avodot. This is not to say, importantly, that they are not, bona fide kohanim. They are kohanim, and thus, verse 22, he may eat the food of his God, of the most holy, as well of the holy. The kohen balmum may still partake of the sacred foodstuffs, meaning the parts of the sacred sacrifices. He's still a kohen, but he may not perform the avodah. And achala paruchet lo yavo vel mizbeach lo yigash. He may not enter behind the curtain or come near the altar. Kimumbo. V'lo yichalel et miktashai ki ani Hashem mekadesham. By doing so, right, he would profane. Thus, he may not profane my sacred space. We'll talk. Why it would be render. Why it would constitute some sort of profaning of the sacred space? So we can speculate. We'll do that in a few minutes. But this is the position of the text, that only kohen of whole, to use again a cultic term, right? Tamim, tam, one who is whole of body, and sort of has this idealized picture of the kohen's body. Only what that person can offer the sacrifices. I'll just note as an aside, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but just as an aside, that we've been translating lo yikrav, lo yigash, again, as like to come forward in order to perform the sacrifice, as opposed to just to come forward to be present at all. It is worth noting that in the Mishnah itself, the Mishnah in Kelim, the Mishnah set rules that a kohen balmum may not be present bein ha'ulam l'mizbeach, between the porch and the altar. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, actually in the Temple Scroll, which I've included on the source sheet, there's reference to a prohibition of any ishiver, any blind, but maybe that's just an example of mumin, of blemishes. A blind man, and not just a kohen apparently, but any person, may not be present at all. And there it's talking, again, it's on the source sheet, but there it's talking not just about the temple, but actually the city in which the temple is present, meaning Jerusalem, right? That the balmum may not be present there at all. That's not the ruling of rabbinic halacha, but perhaps based on these notions are based or receive, again, inspiration on these verses, and also other verses, parallel verses, which are being read, at least as having some resonance, some meaning, whether it's a primary meaning or a secondary meaning, of the prohibition of balmum from being present even being present in the sacred space. That even the presence itself somehow vitiates or violates the sanctity of the place, not merely offering sacrifices proper. Okay. In any event, I'll sort of leave that as a footnote. The main understanding is that the kohen may not, and the primary meaning of these verses interpreted by Chazal is that the balmum kohen may not perform the avodah, may not offer the sacrifices, but is still, of course, a kohen, or maybe not, of course, but the tradition is understood to be, right? And even in this verse over here, still a kohen. And then this is picked up again in verse chapter 22. As I mentioned, there's a parallel discussion with regards to the mumim on an animal. By Moshe Lemor, Daber al Aaron ve'lanav el kol bnei Yisrael v'amart lehem ish min beit Yisrael u'minager b'Yisrael asher yakriv karbano l'chol nadreim l'chol vatam. When anyone, whether an Israelite or otherwise, who offers a sacrifice asher yakrivu l'Hashem la'olah, It should be if it should be to your favor, and it must be to in your favor, must be an acceptable offering. Tamim zachar, male and unblemished. Bakar, baketsavim, ba'izim, these kosher animals. Verse 20, Kol asher b'mum lo takrivu ki lo l'ratzon yihya lachem. So it's by prohibition of offering a blemished animal. I'll leave verse 21 alone for a moment. And then again, it lists a series of blemishes, averet, some of which are parallel to the lists in chapter 21, some of which are different, and the Mishnah sort of seems to correlate them. Averet, oshabor, chortz, or yobelet. How do they translate here? Anything blind, injured, maimed, etc. Right? Lo takrivu l'Hashem, etc. So again, the Chumash juxtaposes the mumim, and they seem to be relatively parallel, or at least in conversation lists between the mumim of the Kohen and the mumim of the animal. And our Mishnah in chapter 6 and 7 of Mishnah Bechorot picks up on that. Now, why does the Mishnah choose to include its this full list? And again, if you read the mishnayot, which everyone I hope is learning on your own alongside our shiurim, which are meant to scaffold that independent learning. If you're learning this mishnayot, you'll see that they're quite involved. These lists, and part of what happens in those mishnayot are de facto interpretations, or even sometimes explicit ezehu, right? What is this term? Interpretations of some of the blemishes articulated here in the Chumash. What is clear, I think, from those and others have pointed this out. What's clear from those lists is the types of blemishes which disqualify, let's say, a priest from doing the avodah, rendering one a kohen balmum, go beyond functional blemishes. I believe the late Professor Aaron Shamash pointed out this distinction, that if you look, for example, and again, this is on the source sheet, the first Mishnah in Tractate Chagiga, about those who are exempted, let's say, from performing the pilgrimage. So there it lists also people who have sort of physical, I'm not going to say blemishes, but physical restrictions, let's say, and those include apparently blemishes that make it difficult for one to walk, to do aliyah l'regel, literally to walk to do the pilgrimage. So those seem like functional disqualifications, while these lists seem to go well beyond the functional and instead enter into, for lack of a better term, the aesthetic, right? Or they violate sort of this picture of tamimut, of the tamim, of the unblemished kohen, not because the blemish prevents them from physically performing the avodah properly, but because of some sense of what is an appropriate physical appearance to be had by one who is serving in the temple, which itself is a place, a highly a beautiful place, right? Deliberately constructed to be impressive physically. So this list goes. These lists go well beyond that. Now, why again is this list here in Mishnah Bechorot? So that takes its cue, I believe, from Devarim chapter 15, where discussing the Bechorot. So the Torah says, "Kol bechor asher yivaled," any firstborn, male firstlings, they translate here, which are born in your herd and your flock. So they have sacred status, right? Takdish l'Hashem Elokecha. Lo ta'avod b'vchor sharecha, you can't work it, right? It's sacred. I remind you of what we mentioned a few weeks ago, I guess it was 2 weeks ago at this point, that the Seforno, when discussing the sanctity of the human firstborn, which requires pidyon, redemption, he says, perhaps the redemption is necessary for the human firstborn. Why? Because if one didn't redeem them, they would have a sacred status akin to that of a sacred animal, and would not be able to do avodat chulin, would not be able to deploy their energies and into just doing, normal, non-sacred, profane, everyday work, right? Because actually they, just like an animal, lo ta'avo b'chor sharecha, the animal can only be used for sacred purposes. If it's sacred, or actually can't be used, it has to be sacrificed. So too, perhaps a Bechor human being requires redemption from their sacred status, because otherwise they would only be able to do sacred work with any of their energies. Otherwise, it would constitute a form of, I don't know if it'd be mi'ilah, sort of a trespass in the sense of using the sacred for profane purposes, or otherwise, or a violation of their kedusha, or something along those lines. So too the Bechor, lo ta'avo b'Bechor sharecha. Rather, it's meant to be eaten by the Kohen. L'fnei Hashem lokecha tochalanu. Should be eaten, and basically it should be sacrificed. It should be sacrificed and eaten qua sacrificial animal. However, here I bolded verse 21 in chapter 15 of Deuteronomy. However, v'chi yevo mum. But if it has any blemish, here they translate any defect again, mum, piseach, oiver, lameness or blindness. Those were two of the initial lists, if you recall, for the Kohanim in Vayikra, and here perhaps this is the first two, and thus the opening to a broader list. These are exemplary mumim. We see that elsewhere in Tanakh. Kol mumra, but any bad, or here they translate any serious defect, lo tizbechen l'Hashem lokecha. So that can't be sacrificed. As you have a Bechor, which has sacred status, which is meant to be Bechor behemat Torah, of course, which is meant to be offered on the mizbeach as a karban and treated as such. But of course, if it's an animal with a mum, so then it cannot be offered. And therefore, if it cannot be offered, in that case, if it develops a mum, b'sharecha tochalenu hatamei tahor yachdav katzvi b'chayal. So then it is treated, basically its kedusha is released, and it can be eaten like chulin. So this is why the halachot of mumim with regards to Bechorot are very central, and why the Mishnah, I believe, chooses to codify this whole list of mumim in Bechorot, taking its cue from this passage. Remember, the Bechor behemat Torah has sacred status, and the Torah explicitly prohibits us from redeeming the Bechor behemat Torah to release its sacred status, because it's destined for the mizbeach, and we don't want to take away from that. That's as opposed to pidyon haben of a human being, or peter chamor, which we talked about again a couple of weeks ago, because that's the subject of the first chapter of Bechorot. So since the Bechor behemat Torah can't be redeemed, so if it be redeemed actively, but if it develops a mum, so then it's released from its status. And actually, if you are unable, let's say we live in a world, and this is the Mishnah and the Talmud and subsequent halachic history are certainly the Talmud, right, and the subsequent halachic history are in such a world without the capacity to offer on the altar, a post-temple world. So then the only way to release a Bechor behemat Torah from its sacred status is if it develops a mum. That's once it has a sacred status. I remind you that the opening Mishnah Bechorot says that an animal which belongs to a Gentile, to a non-Jew, does not take on from the get-go Bechor status, and therefore what's developed is the common practice of selling the animal, or selling more specifically or more accurately selling part of the animal, of the mother animal, selling it to a Gentile, and therefore its Bechor its firstborn wouldn't achieve the halachic status of Bechor from the get-go, and we sort of obviate the need to deal with it with specific care until it develops a mum. However, if one didn't do that, so then the only way out is if the animal is determined to have one of the disqualifying mumim, and that disqualification itself has to be done by an expert. And therefore, the Mishnah lists all the mumim in great detail in our tractate in Mishnah Bechorot. Once it's doing that, it chooses to discuss as well the mumim of the Kohen. And I'll say again what I said a few times already, taking its cue similarly from the Chumash, and also pursuing, I would argue, pursuing an interest in discussing and correlating, or at least juxtaposing, the discussion of the sanctity of firstborn animals, and also those of humans, be they human, bechor or priests. Okay, I have included on the source sheet a few pieces which discuss, the rationale for a disqualification of a Kohen Baal Mum. Obviously, in the human level, there's something, there's a cost to that. But the text itself, text itself, explicitly disqualifies such Kohanim from the avodah proper, and the commentaries deal with it. I'll let you pursue that on your own learning. The source sheets will come out with this recording. I actually want to skip ahead. I've included here a bit about the Mishnah. Let me skip ahead to I think an interesting issue which emerges from discussion of the blemishes of a human, and that has to do with mitzvot which are not avodah proper. They're not actually, offered in Karban in the Mikdash, but are still those of which only a Kohen can do. I specifically want to talk here about Birkat Kohanim. So remind us that the Kohen Baal Mum, let me just articulate this outside at first. The Kohen Baal Mum, the blemish Kohen, is disqualified, right, from performing the avodah on the one hand, and apparently there are some limitations of where he can be present in the temple, but nonetheless is very explicitly and clearly still a Kohen. And that raises the question as to, let's say we get to Birkat Kohanim, well, can the Kohen Baal Mum, who's still a Kohen, but yet is disqualified from performing the avodah, can this person duchen? Can this person perform Birkat Kohanim? Why yes, why no? Well, on the one hand, to the extent that we see Birkat Kohanim as, if not avodah proper, then intimately connected to the avodah, then we might think that just like as the Kohen Baal Mum cannot perform the avodah, so too the Kohen Baal Mum cannot do Birkat Kohanim. That would be one side of the coin. If blessing the people is itself an avodah, or is tightly connected and linked to performing the avodah, so the more one thinks that, the more one would think that a Kohen would be disqualified from doing Birkat Kohanim. On the other hand, of course, to the contrary, if one thinks of Birkat Kohanim as not the avodah, it's more akin to a Kohanic mitzvah, akin to, eating some of these sacrifices and such. They're still Kohanim, right? And still have that status. And as it's not avodah, and it's not, how should I say this? Is not therefore implicated in these restrictions of high aesthetics, right? Of the Mikdash. So then these people, could, perform Birkat Kohanim, and if they can perform Birkat Kohanim, then as it's a mitzvah for them, then they must, right? Should and must. Kot tevarchu, right? They should perform Birkat Kohanim. The source for Birkat Kohanim, right, the fullest source of it is in Numbers chapter 6. Taber al Aaron b'elmanav le'mor, Kot tevarchu b'nei Yisrael, Yirecha Hashem b'shemerecha, etc. The Samuat Shemid, the coda here, right, God says, is by them performing Birkat Kohanim and blessing the people, the Samuat Shemid al b'nei Yisrael, they shall, the translation here says link by name, they shall place by name. on the people of Israel, and I will bless the people of Israel. Why is this mitzvah Birkat Kohanim located where it is in chapter 6 of the book of Bamidbar? So there are those who have argued, I think cogently, that what's happening in the book of Bamidbar at that point is an articulation of the, I guess we could call it sort of the integrity of the camp with the Mishkan in the middle, right? We've counted the people, we've appointed the priests and the Levites, and given them all their respective tasks. I'm right now scanning through my Tanakh, right? We have made sure that all of the Mishkan and its instruments are going to be protected and shall not be violated. And tellingly, we've also had the commandment of making sure, Tzav B'nai Yisrael chapter 5, that anyone who is a tzarua or a zav, or anyone who's tamei, impure, has to leave the camp, in which asher ani shochem b'tocham, in which God dwells, right, in the Mishkan. So protecting the sort of ritual integrity of the camp, as well as the sort of moral spiritual integrity of the camp, right, the laws of Sotah, dealing with the sort of aberrant status of the Nazir, but basically setting up the camp, in short, in a way in which it can hold the Mishkan and hold Asher Ani Shochem B'tocham, hold God's presence amongst the people. And the blessing from the Kohanim seems to be related to that, because that right after we hear about the Torah HaNazir, that's where we have the passage on the screen in front of you of Birkat Kohanim. God says to Moshe, tell Aaron and his son, this is how you should bless the people. Yirech Hashem v'sharecha, Ya'er Hashem panav elecha v'yuchinaka, Yisa Hashem panav elecha v'yisrimecha shalom, v'samu et shemi al b'nei Yisrael v'ani avarchem. And they shall place my name on b'nei Yisrael. So God, the Kohanim through their blessing are placing God's name on b'nei Yisrael, are allowing God, in other words, to be amongst the people, and therefore bless the people. In other words, it's part of facilitating the investiture and the integrity of the Mishkan, of God's presence, of the Mikdash, of God's presence among the people. Indeed, chapter 7 then talks about, right, that Vayehi b'yom kolot Moshe, right after Moshe therefore finishes setting up the tabernacle, then he anoints and consecrates it, and they inaugurate and consecrate the Mishkan. This is paralleled by in Leviticus chapter 9. We see there as well. Vayisa Aaron at yadav ala'am vayvarchem, vayered ma'asot hachatat va'olav hashamim. Aaron lifts up his hands. It's called Nesiut Kapayim. Lifts up his hands and blesses the people. Right? Moshe and Aaron come to the Moed and they leave, and then they bless the people. And vayer kavod Hashem al kol ha'am, meaning it is part of the process of setting up, and perhaps the ongoing functioning of the Mishkan. So I stress all this as a way of evidencing a way of thinking of Birkat Kohanim as not just happens to have taken place by the same priests who would bless the people, but it's a priestly function par excellence, related to the house which they serve, that is to say, the Mishkan and the Mikdash. Even more strongly, we might say, it's a kind of Kohanic avoda. It's a kind of service. It's a kind of service that the Kohanim do, akin or in relationship to, perhaps, the service they perform with regards to the altar. Okay, now it's interesting, there's different directions, right? That is to say, the avoda, the altar, is taking from the people and giving to God, and the blessings are perhaps in the opposite direction, right? Taking God's countenance and blessing and bestowing it towards the people. but perhaps that just actually strengthens the case that it's part of a comprehensive package of the avoda. The more this is the case, the more we might think that kohanim who are bali mumim would be disqualified from performing birkat kohanim. And indeed, if you look at the Sifrei Devarim, the Midrash Halacha Devarim, at least in one version of this midrash, there were different versions. This is the Sifrei discussing the passage in Deuteronomy 21 about the Eglah Arufah, and the text there says, "V'nikshu kohanim b'nei Levi." Then, of course, of discussing the Eglah Arufah procedure, it mentions that the kohanim b'nei Levi shall come forward, and who are these people? These kohanim b'nei Levi. Kivam b'char shmakecha. They're the ones who God has chosen l'sharto. This is bold on the screen. L'sharto u'levarich b'shem Hashem. They're the ones who God has chosen to serve God, maybe in a technical sense, right? To perform the avodah, to be misharet in the sacred place, u'levarich b'shem Hashem, and to bless in God's name. So we see how those two are put together. They seem to be like the core job description of the kohanim b'nei Levi, both to misharet, the avodah, and also birkat, what we would call birkat kohanim, as well as other functions, as well. And also to adjudicate and to direct people in the law. And this is picked up by the Sifrei as follows: "V'nikshu kohanim b'nei Levi, v'klal shne'amar v'sharta b'shem Elokav ein li ela tamimim, bali mumin minayin, tamud lomar b'nei Levi." Right, that b'nei Levi is a more expansive term. And therefore, to some extent, even Bali Mumim are included, at least in some elements of the Kohanic Kohanic jobs. However, look at this: Kivam b'char Hashem Elokav l'sharto levarech shemo. Magid, I put the brackets here because the text here says, the version here says, Magid she'ein birkat kohanim kshera beva'alei mumim. Right, this teaches that birkat kohanim is not kshera. Bali mumim are disqualified from performing birkat kohanim. Why? Because the sharet to levarich shema are juxtaposed. They're one against the other, and just like a Baal mum is disqualified from being misharet, so too he would be disqualified from levarich b'shmo to perform birkat kohanim. I should note that that there are at least two different girsaot, textual witnesses or versions of the Sifrei. For example, in the London manuscript of the Sifrei, which you can find online here from Bar Ilan, London 341. So there it actually has the text says Magid she birkat kohanim kshera beva'alei mumim. There, I believe it's because from the B'nai Levi expansion. So there's in that version of text, Bali Mumin are explicitly ruled that they are ksherim to do birkat kohanim, which just gets to I think the core question that we're dealing with here. To what extent is it considered an avoda? Or to what extent is it considered a separate, different mitzvah that kohanim do? Now, the Talmud actually in Nazir, in discussing birkat kohanim, and picking up from the fact that as I mentioned before, birkat kohanim is is found in Numbers chapter 6, right after the laws of the Nazir. So the Talmud also learns out laws regarding the Nazir to the Kohen who is to birkat kohanim, excuse me. And in discussing this verse of Sharto Levarech Shemo, I'll just sort of zero in on our local context here, but again, it's on the source sheet if you want to see in more detail. So the Gemara raises a possibility that just like a misharet ba'mum lo, afkon mevarich ba'mum lo, right? That raises a possibility, which at least one version of the Sifrei rules like, which is to compare from Misharet, from the service to the Mevarech, and therefore just qualifies a Kohen Baal Mum. And the Gemara there says, well, ha itakash Nazir. Well, on the other hand, Birkat Kohanim is, juxtaposed with it. There's a hekesh between the Kohen who's Mevarech, Birkat Kohanim, and the Nazir. And just like a Nazir, is not disqualified from being a Nazir because of a mum, so too because of Birkat Kohanim, this line indicates a Baal Mum would not be disqualified. That's actually how Tosafot takes it. Tosafot on the place. I'll just read it in summary. He says, "Mushan had ikish lanazir." He cites the lines we just read and says, based on that, mikan nira de Baal Mum mevarech Birkat Kohanim. We can see from this line that it sounds like a Baal Mum, at least fundamentally, midoraita, can do Birkat Kohanim. Kachazina and Hashas rotza l'lmod mevarech misharet amu Baal Mum, because the Gemara raised possibility that a Kohen Baal Mum could not do Birkat Kohanim, and then pushed it aside, and that sounds like, therefore, if you and sort of drop the discussion there. So nira delina nistir kapayim Kohen Baal Mum dosef kapav, and that sounds, therefore, that indicates that a Kohen Baal Mum could fundamentally do Birkat Kohanim. That's basically, I'm going to sort of summarize here I'll skip over the Torah Tamima here. I guess I'll read one piece from the Torah Tamima, where the Torah Tamima says, "V'ani tameh ma'od," right? Kamo ala Gemara, kinal Tosafot, shechakru b'chlal ha'inyanim Kohen Baal Mum noseh et kafaf. He says, what's the question here? Why are they, investigating? Can a Kohen Baal Mum do be duchen? Isn't it an explicit in the Sifrei? And again, but his Sifrei says, I'll just cut to the chase. Magid shebirkat Kohanim sheira b'Baal Mum. Isn't it explicit in his Sifrei that a Kohen Baal Mum can do Birkat Kohanim? But we pointed out that there's different girsaot of that Sifrei. So interestingly, in any event, so far we have been speaking on the biblical level, which, and again, basically normative halacha assumes at the end of the day that a Kohen Baal Mum is fundamentally kasher to perform the avoda, which would mean that the basic understanding of Birkat Kohanim is that it is perhaps related to the avoda, but is not an avoda, and is separate enough from the avoda that it can be performed, as conceptualized as distinct enough that it can be performed by the Baal Mum. However, since we're learning Mishnah, I'll reference another Mishnah which you may have learned in the course of your study, and that's the Mishnah in Megillah, in the 4th chapter, which reads as follows: Kohen sheyesh biyadav mumim lo yisad kapav. A priest who has blemishes on his hands may not perform Birkat Kohanim. If we just stop there, we would think that this Reisha, beginning of the Mishnah, is, just a parallel statement to what we saw in at least one version of the Sifrei, which would constitute an inherent or an essential disqualification of a Kohen, Baal Mum, from performing Birkat Kohanim. However, when you read on, Rabbi Yehuda says, and this is going to sound like an extension or an expansion of the prohibition, but ends up also introducing for lack of a better word, a leniency or a narrowing of the prohibition, a limitation of the prohibition. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Af misha hayu yadav svuot istis ufua lo yisad kapav. Even one whose hands are dirty, right? They're colored with dye, right? He also may not perform the avodah. That's not a mum. That's not something inherent physically on the person's hand. That's it happened incidentally. They happen to have dirty hands at that moment, or lo yisad kapav. That person also cannot perform the avodah. So right away we're thinking, at least according to Rabbi Yehuda, and maybe also according to the Tanakhama, there's something else at play here. And there's actually, at the end of the Mishnah, it gives a reason for this ruling, for at least Rabbi Yehuda again, but maybe it's for everyone's thinking in the Mishnah, because the dye on the Kohen's hand will cause people to stare at him. What's the concern of them staring at him? Commentators go in different directions, but one way of thinking about this is that it takes away from the integrity of the experience of Birkat Kohanim. Maybe people's minds will be distracted. Somehow it'll take away from the reverence for the experience. Be taken in whatever direction one takes it. Not for now. It's clearly the reasoning here, Mipnei she'am mistaklin bo, is clearly different than Mipnei shehu ba'mumu pasul avoda. Right? It's not something inherent, but rather contingent. The people will stare at him, and maybe that's also animating the prohibition or the disqualification by the Tanakama, but in the beginning of the Mishnah, Kohen sheyesh pi'adav mumim lo yisat kapav. Maybe the concern there is also not essential, but contingent, or say differently, not a psul de'oraita, not a fundamental disqualification of the Kohen who is blemishes from performing the Birkat Kohanim, but rather a secondary rabbinic concern. The way that the latter formulation is clearly how this Mishnah and halacha is taken and how it is developed in the Gemara and in later halachic history. That it's a contingent, secondary rabbinic concern that a Kohen Ba'mum, or one who has dirty hands, is disqualified because it'll take away from the experience. People will stare at him. But what that means is, as the Talmud will discuss, and this is on your source sheet, that if it's someone who's dash be'ira, if it's somebody who is well known in his locale, someone who lives there and people knows and is used to seeing this person, so that person then may actually perform, that Kohen may perform Birkat Kohanim. If they may, then I assume they must perform Birkat Kohanim, because people are used to it. And if they're used to the way this person looks, then it's not going to distract them from the experience or cause them to stare during the course of the Birkat Kohanim. Or similar considerations, again, it's on your source sheet for later on, if the person, if their whole body or their hands also, if they're wearing socks, if they're covered, if the blemish is covered because of the talit being draped upon them during the Birkat Kohanim, they're wearing socks again, as opposed to being barefoot, covering anything on their feet. So then also they are able to perform Birkat Kohanim. So it's taken as a secondary and therefore overcomable, right? Rather than essential, disqualification. That all being said, I do have to raise the question of, is there not nonetheless, and I'm not sure about this, but I raise this for someone to think about, is there not nonetheless some echo here of the core de'oraita considerations and disqualifications of a Kohen Ba'mum for performing the avoda, and there's, even on the rabbinic and overcomable level of disqualifying Kohen Ba'mum, some echo of a sense which says, yes, Birkat Kohanim is different than avodah, and fundamentally, yes, a Kohen Ba'mum can still duchen, can still perform Birkat Kohanim, still a Kohen after all. But there is a way of thinking about Birkat Kohanim differently, which is that it is a kind of avodah, and therefore, unless we can overcome dash be'iro or covering with the talit and such, unless we can overcome the concern and sort of hide away that blemish, or find a way to ignore it, the side of the conceptual side which thinks of Birkat Kohanim as connected to and even a form of avodah, remains, and therefore, Kohen sheyesh bi'adav mumin lo yisa et kapav, as we see here in the Drisha of the Mishnah. Again, as I said earlier, discussing people, individuals, and their bodies and their disqualifications due to quote end quote abnormalities. I use those quotes quite advisedly. Abnormalities is a sensitive issue, an appropriately sensitive issue, and the human cost is significant. Dealing with that in great depth is beyond the scope of this particular shiur. So I'll stop here, but I hope that this framing, both backwards back to the Chumash and as the backdrop of these prakim in Bechorot, Mishnah prakim Vav and Zayin, respectively, and also a way of thinking about this carrying forward with regards to halachot besides Bechorot, as the Seder Kohanim. I hope this has been helpful, and I wish you much luck in the rest of your learning of the mishnayot of Masechet Bechorot. Until next time.